Welcome back to the Belonging Network Summit. Our next guest is a legend among diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leaders, none other than Howard Ross, a lifelong social justice advocate and the founder of Cook Ross, a global diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. Howard is considered one of the world's seminal thought leaders on identifying and addressing unconscious bias. He authored the Washington Post bestseller, Everyday Bias, along with other titles, including Reinventing Diversity and his newest book, Our Search for Belonging. He has also been published by the Harvard Business Review, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and has been a regular guest on National Public Radio for more than 10 years. Among Howard's many accolades and accomplishments, he served as the Janetta B. Cole Professor of Diversity at Bennett College for Women, the first time a white man had served in such a position at a historically Black college. He also served on numerous nonprofit boards, including the Diversity Advisory Board of the Human Rights Campaign, the Board of Directors of Dignity and Respect Campaign, and the Board of Directors for the National Women's Mentoring Network. Given Howard's incredible leadership as an ally advancing many social justice causes over the years, I'll be asking him to guide us through what it means for men, and in particular white men, to stand up and serve as allies for underrepresented people and communities in the workplace. So we'll first frame our discussion by exploring what male allies are, why they matter when it comes to building inclusive organizations, and of course we'll gain everyday strategies to help you engage a greater number of men as you advance your organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments. So with no further ado, Howard, thank you so much for being with us during the summit. I'm really thrilled to have you here. Just kind of going back, I remember when we first met at PFLAG's Straight for Equality Gala, which I think was over a decade ago. And I was so impressed by your words about what it meant to be an ally for LGBTQ people and communities. And it's clear that you are a person who walks your allyship talk. So to help us frame our conversation for today, can you share with us your own working definition of what it means to be an ally, and specifically a white male ally, when it comes to building more inclusive organizations in the workplace?
Sure, Rose. It's so good to talk to you again, and thank you so much for that generous introduction. My father would have believed it, and my mother maybe, but I appreciate it.
Sure.
It's really interesting. I think when we talk about allyship, I think one of the things that we need to really understand is the frame of reference that we often use. Sometimes when we're thinking about allyship, people see it as, I'm here to help. And there's nothing wrong with helping, but I think it's a very thin and shallow way of looking at allyship. I start with the notion that equality for everybody means equality for me and my family as well. And even as a white-skinned man, especially being Jewish, I'm very clear about this when I look back at my own family history, having enormous family loss during the Holocaust. And most of folks who are here with us know that very famous quote from Reverend Niemoller, where he says, first they came for the gypsies and I wasn't a gypsy, so I didn't care. Then they came for the Jews and I wasn't a Jew. And finally he gets to, and then they came for me and there was nobody left to care anymore. And I think that there's a fundamental truth to that we're building a world for all of us. And I have no doubt that, as Dr. King said, that white people benefit from racial healing as well as people of color do, that men benefit from gender healing. So it's not an entirely altruistic phenomenon. For me, my opportunities to partner with and to work next to and to get to know and be mentored by people in groups outside of myself have been enormously valuable in my life, not just valuable from a business standpoint, but also from the standpoint of personal development. So I think foundationally, I look at allyship more as partnership. I see it more as standing arm in arm with somebody and recognizing the interdependence of our ability to be safe and to succeed in life. And if a person next to me, regardless of their group, is not being able to be successful, then it affects me as well. It affects all of us as well. And I think it's only when we see that in that context that we can ever achieve true allyship.
That's a wonderful definition. I think the allyship as partnership is a great place to start as a foundation. So when it comes to talking about white men, I think it's also helpful to define some of the advantages that we white guys have in the workplace. And in doing this, can you give us your working definition of privilege, and specifically white male privilege, and how that shows up in the workplace? I think that's also helpful to acknowledge and to talk about. Although sometimes when we do, some white men tend to bristle at the P word, as what I call it. So can you help us with that?
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we have in understanding privilege, and one of the reasons that people do have the reaction you're talking about, and this, by the way, is true for both people who feel like they're the quote targets of that. In other words, for the white guys who are saying, who are hearing us like you've got privilege, but also sometimes for those of us in the diversity space who are talking about this concept is. We take a concept of privilege, which is really a systemic concept, and we personalize it, and that's always problematic. So when I think about privilege, I think of this as I said, a systemic phenomenon that we live in a society that has been, whether you like it or not, run by white men from the very beginning. White men, were the people who formulated this culture. They made the rules in this culture for a long period of time. Women were not allowed to even vote in this culture. People of color certainly were not allowed to vote, and had, many were enslaved or in many other ways suppressed by this culture. And so the culture formulates around people who are in leadership in it, and it becomes our normative ways of being. It becomes our expected ways of being, the anticipated ways of being. We begin to judge, quote, normal behavior by the standards of the people who are the most predominant in that culture. And so, if we look at our leaders acting in a particular way, that becomes the way we feel like we're expected to act. And so for those of us who've grown up in this culture as white men, this doesn't necessarily mean anything about us personally in terms of our intention or our goodness, or anything like that. It means simply that we have certain advantages, regardless of our background and where we came from, that other people don't have. Now, the counter to that, a lot of people will say, you see people like Bill O'Reilly who'll say, well, I don't know, white girls. I grew up in Levittown. I was, yeah. But as a 6'5" white guy growing up in that environment, it was much easier for him to get out of that environment than it would have been had he been an African-American man or an African-American woman in that same environment. And that's not to say that everybody's environment was gilded or that was paved in gold, nor does it say that we should diminish the accomplishments of many people who did come from very low income backgrounds or not at all privileged backgrounds and were able to accomplish things. It means simply that we can begin to notice that there's certain times when we might get deference, that we might not have to deal with the same kind of stereotypes, that people may have higher expectations for us or be willing to take a greater risk with us, that they may feel more comfortable with us and less unsafe with us, that in all of these various different, some subtle, some not so subtle ways, it's just an easier path to travel.
Yeah. And I really like, everything that you said. I think on the piece of the personalizing perspective and recognizing it's really distancing ourselves as individuals from the systems that we're inheriting, and what we do with that, recognizing that there are many advantages to that, and how do you then leverage that power, that privilege in a way, in the context of this conversation, and we'll go there. We'll kind of unravel that. Yeah. I want to go next to just looking at leaders, out in the world and trying to shift culture. So a couple of examples just to kind of frame this next question. So in 2014, actress Emma Watson addressed the United Nations, urging men to join the feminist movement under the hashtag he for she. And former President Obama garnered attention when he self-identified as a feminist. So these public figures definitely are influencing public opinion, with increasing focus on male allies. And given your extensive experience working with global multinational corporations, is corporate culture also being influenced to increase its focus on male allies? And if so, what are you seeing in the work that you're doing, the work that you've done in the past, and where you're going now with your new business?
Yeah, I think that first of all, there's no question we're moving more in that direction, and I think it's incredibly heartening. I mean, this CEO pledge that Tim Ryan put together, and a lot of movement to establish that diversity is just something that's really important moving forward. And it's very true that in a lot of cases people are doing that because it just makes pure business sense. I mean, when we look at the changing demographics of the workforce and the workplace and the marketplace, if you're not paying attention to this, you're going to lose business. So anybody who doesn't is not being a very good business person at this point.
Right.
I think that when we look at the role that leaders play, one of the things that I'm seeing that's really interesting, and particularly around the gender issues that you were referring to, is that we have a lot more people who are in high-level positions of leadership, men in high-level positions of leadership in corporations today, not only in the United States, but around the world, who I've talked to, CEOs and COOs who say to me, you know, I always thought this was important, but when my daughter graduated law school, I watched how hard it was for her to ... Or when my daughter graduated business school, I noticed, or my daughter tells me the way she's treated. And that so many more people are having a personal experience from somebody in their family, their daughter, their wife, their sister, their cousin, whoever, and understanding more and more, I think, the subtleties of how that plays itself out. And I think one of the challenges that we have is to avoid having people only focus on the dramatic issues all the time. Not that we don't, of course, we focus on dramatic issues when they occur. You know, Me Too has done a brilliant job of that,
Yeah.
bringing it to our awareness. But we have to also understand that it's the more subtle issues that often get missed. These what have often been called micro inequities or micro advantages that one person or another has, and that those are more likely to be the things that most people deal with on a day-to-day basis than somebody who actually does something as egregious as Harvey Weinstein. In a weird sense, the Harvey Weinsteins of the world are easier to deal with because the behavior is so egregious and so obviously bad. It's great. It's easy to get people aligned on it. Much harder to get people to look at how often do you give assignments to women than men, or vice versa. How open are you to give a stretch assignment to a young woman versus a young man, something that they haven't established. And yet we know those are the decisions far more that build careers.
Yeah. And so you're seeing then the male leaders and kind of CEO positions, C-suite, pointing out some of these micro inequities, right? And when they're doing that, how does it show up in terms of kind of broader inclusion work that you've seen or that's taking place now?
Well, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that far too often we in the diversity community have created a certain exclusivity. Now it's how woke people are. We've created a new standard of ins and outs. You're not as woke as I am, or there's still some people who believe that the only people who should be doing diversity and inclusion work are women or people, white women or men and women of color, or, and so we actually feed this notion that this work isn't for you, where, I've always believed from the beginning, obviously I wouldn't have spent 35 years of my professional career doing this if I didn't believe it, that this is work for everybody and that should be for everybody. And so when we give space for leaders to have a role in that, they feel good about themselves. They feel like they can make a contribution. And when they get that positive sense of engagement, when they realize, wow, this is really interesting, this is really fun to engage with people who are different, have honest conversations, then they're far more willing to take some risks. They're far more willing to go back to their own peer group and say, hey, look, I spent time with the African American Business Resource Group yesterday, and it was incredibly enlightening. And out of that, I've realized that we need to do X, Y, Z. And, maybe saying this is the CEO saying this to, a group of 12 people, 11 of whom are white men. And those guys are sitting around, and their first reaction might be, what's he drinking? Or boy, did he drink the Kool-Aid? But ultimately, if he sticks to that and turns it into action, they'll start having some of those experiences as well and realize that this is not dangerous territory for them. It's actually an opportunity for incredible growth and learning. And as I said earlier, a way to improve the business performance.
Yeah. And I'm so happy that you are talking about both engagement and this idea that this work is exclusive, that there's only certain people that can or ought to do inclusion work. And so research tells us that in order to get men involved, we have to raise their awareness about why this work matters. And before we talk about how to do that, because I know that that's where the audience wants to go, I want you to help us understand kind of what men are thinking and specifically why some are hesitant to get engaged with workplace inclusion efforts.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to look at the history. When we look at the history of the diversity movement and go back, I go back, like I said, I got paid for my first diversity workshop 35 years ago. Yeah. And I had been, even at that point, I'd been doing work for 20 years socially, getting involved in civil rights from the time I was a teenager.
Yeah.
And I think if we go back to the early stages, for those of us who have been around long enough to remember them, we know that mostly the work was targeted at white men. And I say that very carefully. It was really was, we're here to fix you. You are the problem. And so we conducted these find them and fix them trainings. And sometimes we took out a 2x4 and I whacked people on the side of the head until they saw the error of their ways. And if somebody cried, it was really cathartic and all that. But what happened in my experience was when I started to see a lot of those folks a month later, I'd say, well, how is it? How's it been going? Well, that was okay, but don't ever make me do it again. because people were left shamed and wounded about things that they didn't even know that they were doing wrong. Now, I'm not talking about the Lester Maddixes or the George Wallaces or the Richard Spencers of the world. I mean, how to deal with them is really clear. You have to isolate them and make sure that you can restrict the damage they can do. I'm talking about the everyday person who wakes up in the morning and doesn't wring their hands and say, how can I suppress women and people of color today, or something like that. They just go to work to do a job. And then somebody comes and says, you're a privileged white man and da-da-da-da-da. And of course they get very defensive. And we even contribute sometimes through our language. We'll say, how many diverse employees do you have? As if that's the same thing as saying how many employees of color. And then when we open up invitations for people to come and join the diversity committee, we're surprised that that's who shows up and that the people who didn't feel included didn't show up. So I think that there's a responsibility on those of us in the diversity space to create an invitation. Now that's not speaking to I'm not saying buy into white fragility. I'm not saying tiptoe around people. I'm just saying start with a sense that this person is reachable. And don't make assumptions about the person simply because of their age, their race, their gender, or the like. Because I can tell you that some of the people who've been the most remarkable leaders that I've seen relative to diversity and inclusion have been people who did not look like you would think they would be those leaders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so this kind of builds off of what you're talking about. And it goes back to what we had mentioned in the bio, which you are one of the world's seminal thought leaders when it comes to identifying unconscious bias. You've written the book on it, literally. So what guidance would you offer our participants when it comes to addressing unconscious biases that show up for white men? So you had alluded to kind of a couple of decades ago of like looking at white men in particular, pointing out you are the problem and shutting down possible allies, right? So where can we start to help raise awareness and increase engagement of white men and avoid this kind of phenomenon of shutting down white men by kind of pointing to them as if pointing to us as if we are the problem?
Right. I think, it's interesting, Rose. I think, we start with a fundamental understanding of how human beings learn.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that, very few people who had a teacher who came in with a ruler in their hand and said, encouraged a lot of learning. For most of us, we're struggling to survive. And I think, so we start with understanding that human beings tend to feel more comfortable and more open when they can relate to the person who they're talking to and not when they're made to feel different. And we know now that there's research, hard scientific research about this, because empathy can actually be studied in the brain. We know that empathy is produced by the premotor cortex of the brain in the form of what we call mirror neurons. And these can be measured, and there are people, our good friend Sukhvinder Obi up at McMaster University, for example, in Canada, who's doing incredible work around this and how that shows up in terms of power and the like. So we know we can see what happens with empathy. And what we know is that the more people are reinforced to believe that somebody is different from them, the less empathy they naturally have. And so a lot of the work that we've done where we say, well, you'll never understand what it is to be a white man, you'll never understand what it is to be in such and such, actually may be intended to kind of whack people across the side of the head, wake them up. But the intent of what it actually creates is in the inner system is fear. You're different from me, therefore I have to be more protective and less empathetic. And so I think I often start whenever I'm doing a workshop on bias, always start by sharing one of my own. And if people go online and see the talk I gave at Google when Everyday Bias comes out, I tell a story in that one, and because what I want to say to people is, I've got biases, you've got biases, we all have biases. And this is, of course, the breakthrough, I think, in our learning about bias was the understanding of the naturalness of it, the normalcy of it in human beings. And we're never going to get rid of it. We could just learn to manage or mitigate it better.
Right.
So I think when we begin to do that, we begin to say, I don't think you're a terrible person. You're no different than me. I have these biases. You have those biases. Let's sit down and roll up our sleeves and figure out, why does the mind do this? How do we make these decisions? And what can we do to manage them so that we're making decisions consistent with our values?
Right. And I'm really glad that you brought up the brain science, because it leads into this next question, which is our shared passion for the concept of belonging. So we both wrote books on that. And in your book, Our Search for Belonging, you write about the paradox of tribalism. And I just want to kind of read out this quote and go into the next question. So you wrote, as humans, we are hardwired with a need to belong, which ends up making us deeply connected with some yet deeply divided from others. When these tribes are formed out of the fear or the other on topics such as race, immigration status, religion, or partisan politics, we resort to an us versus them attitude. Especially in the digital age, when we're all interconnected in one way or another, these tensions seep into our daily lives and we become secluded with our self-identified tribes. So when it comes to the workforce, how do we move beyond the tribalism paradox that you write so eloquently about and move into a world where belonging leads to unity for all of us, beyond just one dominant culture that is in the workplace?
I think one of the things is we have to create the big us.
Yeah.
And this is so important. I think, in the book, we did an extensive interview with George Halverson, who's now retired, but was the CEO of Kaiser Permanente, who talks brilliantly about how he did this at Kaiser and used that way of thinking to take them to the top of the marketplace. We do come in with, it's natural in human beings, just like I was saying before, it's natural for us to have bias. It's also natural and quite automatic in human beings to divide people between us versus them. And this probably goes back, centuries and centuries to when we were living in caves and jungles and you'd see a group of people around a water hole and you had to make that instant determination whether it was us or them. And if you made the wrong determination, you die. So we have a very, we have a very strong tendency to very quickly determine whether this person is safe or unsafe, is one of me or not one of me. Am I going to be safe interacting and engaging with them? What's happened in our current environment, and I'm talking about the social environment now, which affects the workplace, but it doesn't start in the workplace, is that the lines in society, and this is no news to anybody who pays attention, the lines in society have gone from basically a bell curve where for the most part, in the middle, people were, I agree with you on this issue, I disagree with you on that issue, and we kind of go back and forth, and then you had some people on the extremes, to what I call a dumbbell curve, where everything's on the extremes now and nothing's in the middle. And this is reinforced by social media, it's reinforced by bifurcation of mainstream media sources or cable news, where instead of all of us looking at the same news, one person gets news interpreted with more of a leftward slant. Some people gets news interpreted by more of a rightward slant. And so the information itself that we get, not just the interpretation, is different. And then we reinforce that because we only stay on friends with Facebook with the people who agree with us, or we defriend people who don't, or on Twitter, the same thing. We block people who don't agree with us until at some point we're living in these echo chambers of our own creation. And that's what we take to work with us every day. And especially now when we have the kind of toxic environment we have now, if I'm working next to somebody who voted for that other person from me, that's in my way of dealing with them. And you see this, you and I both see it all the time. People say, well, you can't have voted for, I hear it a lot on the left because that's mostly where my community is. You can't have voted for Trump and not be a racist, that sort of a thing. And I have to say that I have the same appalling reaction to the white supremacy that the president represents in so many ways. As everybody else does. But one of the things I did for the book is, went out and I've now interviewed well over 100 people who voted for President Trump. And what I found is that, it was surprisingly unclear in a lot of cases how much people really understood that, whether they saw it that way, whether they believe it that way. But what was very clear was being demonized by the other side because of their participation, or that vote that they took, has actually been driving them more into that camp rather than pulling them more out of it. And this is the challenge that we have, is to not be so reactive and so condemning. And the workplace, I think, is one of our last great hopes to do something about that.
Yes. And in your research, are you seeing trend? And it sounds like you're still doing interviews or engaging with folks around this content. Are you starting to see some trends of what can get us to that place of making a bigger us, rather than, kind of our tendencies to go into this dumbbell curve, as you said?
Yes.
Kind of be with people that make us feel good because they remind us of ourselves.
Yeah. In fact, a little commercial. My son Jake and I. My son is studying organizational psychology and psychology of happiness at UC Berkeley, and he and I are going to be writing a follow-up book together to our Search for Belonging that'll be coming out in about a year. It's going to be called Building Belonging: 9 Ways to Build More Joyful and Inclusive Work Environments. Or at least that's the working title of it. And we're going to be talking about exactly that. But I think there are a number of things we could do. I think we first start by building a very clear sense in the organization of what we're all up to together, that people have to have some sense of vision and direction that they're aiming towards. One of the challenges I think that historically we've had around diversity and inclusion that has limited us in some ways is that it's usually too much about fixing and not enough about building. Human beings are inspired by building things. They get fatigued at some point by fixing things.
Yeah.
And when we're oriented towards fixing things, it's almost always past-based. When we're oriented towards building things, it's future-based. So I think that that's one piece of it, is we create a really clear sense, here's where we're going. And the second part of it is, here's the role that you play in getting us there, that all of you in this organization play a role in getting us there. Then I think we can structurally look at some things we can do. So one way is to create a context in which we can have constructive conversations, conversations at the workplace. You know, my dear friend Caroline Wanga, who's the Chief Diversity Officer at Target Corporation, or James Momon, another really good friend of mine at General Mills, have really been just great examples of people who are courageously bringing employees together or associates together to talk about some of these issues in constructive ways, and in doing so, teaching them how to have those conversations. And this is another piece that I think we need to do, is to teach people how to have difficult conversations. We're not raised to know how to handle difficult and contentious conversations. For the most part, most people avoid those kinds of things. And so if we could begin to teach people that there are ways to do this in constructive and safe ways, personal safe ways, that allow us to explore this, then what we begin to find is often people go, wow, this is fascinating. I got a completely different sense. I mean, I can't tell you how many of the folks I spoke to who were Trump voters, especially in the early stages, who, when they started to share with me, it was like, wow, I never thought that could be causing this kind of reaction. You know, I never thought that this particular, for example, so many of them have told me one of the reasons they really like Trump is because they're sick and tired of people on the left, you know, treating them like they're less than. And at first I was pretty defensive about that until I started to really pay attention, and I saw how disparaging people were towards you know, certain people in our society, towards working class people, particularly working class white men, and the assumptions we make about them, that if you're a blue collar white guy, you must be a racist or a sexist, that sort of a thing. And so where else, if I want to belong, if I want to go somewhere where I feel like I am valued, I am seen, I am known for what I give, how am I going to then go into that side of the equation? There's not a lot of space for me over there. And so when this guy stands up with his orange hair and says, you know, I'm sick and tired of them calling you names. Yeah, I can buy into that. And we have to accept that we've played some role in that. That doesn't mitigate the challenges, of course, with dealing with that, not only that individual, but also the movement around him. But I do think that we need to understand that in any relationship between human beings, both sides play a role, and we do need to work on our side of the equation at the same time.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you just like the shift of kind of fixing a culture and the fatigue that comes from that versus this vision of building something together and working across difference. I think that in and of itself is it's a fresh way of thinking about this work. And you know, I'm sure some folks are watching like, yes, you know, we're doing that now. So that's some confirmation that you're on the right path. You know, in recent years, like on this topic of building, you know, a growing number of workplaces are recognizing the powerful impact that men as allies have with respect to advancing workplace inclusion. So from your extensive experience working with many global corporations, why do you believe more organizations are attempting to launch, quote, men as allies programs?
Well, I think it's very practical. I mean, if you've got an enormously higher percentage of men, and especially white men, in leadership positions, and if you're trying to do all your diversity and inclusion work around them and in reaction to them, you're not going to be able to have as much change as when you get them into the mix. And it's just that simple. I mean, you know, we've got to have everybody involved if we're really going to have any kind of sustainable corporate culture change. And so if we start by saying, no, only white women and men, women of color or LGBTQ folks or whatever are going to be working on these issues, then we're just not going to be able to be as successful. And so there's some practicality in it. I think that the other is that we realize that when we are in partnership, when we're standing side by side, our ability to address issues is much more fulsome. You get a more rounded perspective. You know, one of the things a number of my more progressive clients are starting to do is to shift, for example, the way they do their employee resource groups or business resource resource groups from being identity oriented to being issue oriented. So,
Yeah.
for example, rather than having a women's ERG, employee resource group, have a gender equity employee resource group where men and women who are both committed to gender equity can participate. And it doesn't mean you still can't have some times when they have individual time. So one organization that was doing this, nearby here, a physics lab that I've worked with, created their gender equity group that way. And at the beginning of all their meetings, the men started alone, the women alone. They spent some time talking about what had been going on for maybe 45 minutes. They then come back and share their perspectives. And then for the next hour together, they sort of roll up sleeves together and say, how can we move this forward? So any solution that comes out is inclusive of all people who are interested in working on it. And I think that's much more powerful in the long run for sustainable change than to have it only come from one group.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's definitely an approach of making a bigger us, as you said. And, for any of these programs, whether you're launching an ERG that's focused around an issue like gender equity, or in launching a Men as Allies program, which is more identity based.
Yes.
What are some of those foundations that a workplace ought to consider before moving forward full steam with launching a program like that? And I know you have a lot of experience with doing this, but say, there's some folks watching right now and they're gung-ho, they're like, yes, we want to do this. And they haven't yet done some of the foundational work. What would you recommend first before going?
Well, I think first of all, we have to recognize that we want to have everybody understand themselves better, but that folks in the dominant group, whether that's men, Christians, heterosexuals, whatever, whatever we want to say, are generally speaking, as a rule, less aware of the group dynamic and how it affects them than people in non-dominant groups. LGBTQ people, for example, have to be very aware on a daily basis of the dynamics of sexual orientation in order to survive in society. I don't. If I don't want to pay any attention to those dynamics, I can blissfully ignore them, and except in very rare circumstances, it won't be an issue for me, right? And so as a result of that, a lot of times when people are in dominant positions, when we're talking about men in this particular case, when we're in dominant positions around gender, we don't put things together in our mind quite in the same way. We see a series of individual circumstances, whereas women see patterns. So if somebody, for example, says something at a meeting, and nobody seems to pay attention to it, and then 10 minutes later, a person of a different gender says that same thing, and all of a sudden it's an aha moment, which women see all the time. And somebody brings it to our attention, we'll say, well, yeah, but that happens to everybody. And there's some truth to that. It does happen to everybody, except it happens about 9 times more often for women than it does for men. But because we're not looking in the pattern, we're only looking at the individual circumstance, we don't see that disparity. Women see it because they are always looking at patterns in order to be able to survive. So one of the things that we need to do to start with is to bring awareness of whiteness to white people, awareness of gender to men, awareness of sexual orientation to heterosexual people, so that we can begin to understand the way that formulates itself for us and the way that causes us to act in an organization. And there's some people who are doing some extraordinary work around this. Particularly, I want to give a shout out to Bill Proudman and his group at White Men as Full Diversity Partners, who are based actually near you in Portland.
Yeah.
And just who've been doing this for years. Bill is exceptional professional. He's been doing this for years, and there are other people as well, but he's one of the best. But to be able to sit down and get guys to start looking at this and say, all right, what is it to be a man in today's society, and how much are we also put in a box and expected to behave in particular ways that may or may not be consistent with our own way of being, and the way we really want to live in life. And that's not in any way to equate the pain of being white with the pain of being of color, or the pain of being a man with the pain of being a woman, difficulty, I should say, of being a woman. I'm not saying they're equitable. There's still power differentials and the like, but there's still benefit in having that self-awareness.
Yeah. And so, and then this goes back to the awareness raising and how important that is as a foundation to get started with the work. Aside from trainings, I know that you are super innovative in how to have these kind of conversations and being creative about it. What might be some other avenues that workplaces can bring into their organizations to begin doing the awareness raising, outside of just kind of an unconscious bias training that happens for a couple hours? maybe an hour for some of the organizations that are watching. What else could be done that might be a little less formal or a little more creative and engaging to bring more people into a space and to engage in what can feel like risky conversations?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think look, this is very important. I mean, I've never, it's funny, when you get known for things, people think that's all you do. And
Yeah.
I've been so many trainings and talks on unconscious bias. People think that I advocate unconscious bias training as the answer. And it's not true at all. I come from an organizational development and culture change background. And so for me, systems change is where it's at. I do think that adequate and exceptional education can be a real starter. And it could be really helpful. And one of the things that we know, for example, is that the best education relative to performance where bias is concerned is not education that says, do you know that these other people experience this? It's education that teaches you how to understand the way you think and make decisions. And there's some really hard scientific research from, for example, Lehigh University Medical School and Arizona State University that shows that when people engage in those kinds of trainings, it actually shows up in terms of more egalitarian behavior. But training, even the best training, is only like joining the gym. You join the gym, you meet with your trainer, you get your workout program. If you walk away from it then and say, okay, now I'm in shape, you'll find that you're not.
Yes.
And so being in a good training, which raises our awareness, then puts us into action. And the actions, I think, can show up in many ways. The three major areas that I usually include people to think about after they've had good foundational education and their awareness has shifted. The second one is, how do we then use that education when we need it? So let's say you go into great unconscious bias training and you don't have to do a performance review for 4 months. What are the odds you're going to remember it? I mean, very slim, right? But if before you went into that performance review, you looked at a little 2 or 3 minute video that said, hey, you're going into performance review. Here are 4 or 5 things to remember that can help you mitigate bias in the performance review. Then at that moment, all the training comes back to you.
Yeah.
And so priming techniques like that have been found to be enormously valuable. And that can be done in lots of different ways. Like I said, a little video clip. My old company, Cook Ross, has a great set of tools, performance support tools that if people are interested, they could check out about that. It can be simply a series of questions to ask. Before we look at this resume, answer these questions to yourself, or as you're looking at the resume. Does anything about this person remind you of yourself? Is that positive or negative? Do they remind you of somebody else? Is that a positive or negative? Are there any things about the resume that jump out at you that you have a strong reaction to? So you bring awareness to the one who's perceiving, not just the thing that's being perceived.
Yeah.
So that's a second. And then the third after that, so first education, the second is priming. The third is to actually look at our structures and systems and to find ways that we can mitigate the impact of bias in some of our structures and systems. And as you know, Rose, in Everyday Bias, in the appendix to Everyday Bias, there's 17 pages, literally 17 pages of ideas how you can do this in the talent management system, better ways to recruit, better ways to interview, better ways to conduct performance reviews, all of which are designed to be less susceptible to bias. We'll never eliminate it, but we can learn to be less susceptible. And then the fourth is to be sure that we have some kind of a accountability system, some kind of a way to track metrics so that we're really clear how what we're doing is impacting people. Because I can't tell you how many times I've seen great ideas that we've done as diversity practitioners, and I've done it myself, which sounded really good. And then you notice like there's a corresponding reaction that it causes that actually is countervalued to what we're doing.
Yes.
And so I think that those are a few things that people can do.
I think those are all great suggestions, and I love the gym analogy, right? It's not a one and done. It's not something that's static. It's ongoing, and to try to keep it fresh. And I really like those 4 different approaches, or 3 different approaches after the education piece. I think that's super helpful. So in kind of rounding out the interview, I know that I had a lot of questions for you. I want to give you the opportunity, if there's one thing about allyship with respect to engaging white men in particular that we haven't yet covered, I want to give you the floor and inspire our audience with maybe something else that you've been burning to say in this entire interview that it hasn't come up yet. So is there anything that is really important, or any kind of inspiration for folks watching to, just take one action after today's talk and try to experiment?
Sure, of course. I think it really it starts with an understanding. We began the interview talking about the state our society's in, and we know it just gets worse by the day, it seems. this incredible toxicity and goes back and forth. And the more we see something on the other side, the more we move farther on our side, and it keeps going farther and farther apart. And the more justified we feel. And, I'm pretty active in social media, and I know I can get hooked sometimes as hard as I try, and get reactive. I try to, when it happens, I apologize and keep moving forward, because I'm not willing to disengage at this particular time, given the crisis that we're in. But I do think that we have to be careful about that just, your mother wears combat boots. You may feel good, but it's not a very effective strategy for changing people's minds. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have, is that coming from the standpoint of people who are committed to diversity, inclusion, equity, and accessibility in our society, that we can't simply allow our indulgences of telling other people how terrible they are, because what that will do is reinforce their being on the other side. And, an old teacher of mine used to say, when you go fishing, you bait the hook with what you don't bait the hook with what you like to eat, you bait the hook with what the fish likes to eat. Yeah. I think that if we're really committed to change, to be real change advocates, then that means showing a little bit more empathy and understanding to people who are on the other side of the equation. And one tool that I would leave folks with is a tool that, as you know, I talk about in our Search for Belonging. It comes out of the work of Elizabeth Lesser, who was one of the co-founders of the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, and she calls it "Take the Others to Lunch." I adapted it somewhat, but and it really is the idea is to choose somebody in your life who is on the other side of an issue from you. If it's around gender, you're a woman, choose a man choose a woman, where you have some differences of points of view, where if it could be politics, it could be anything, and then just invite them to have a conversation with you for the purpose of understanding each other. Because this is where it all starts, is that don't start from don't start from trying to convince them or talk them into it. Start by trying to develop mutual understanding. Now, for those, just to pause, for those who say, yeah, but we got to create change, I promise you, when you understand the people you're dealing with, you'll be more effective at creating change, even if that's the only reason you do it. So you know what the trigger points are, you know what their needs are, you know what they're listening for. You'll be much more effective at being able to change their minds. But going back to it, so then you agree, the ground rules are, that's why we're here. Then you ask each other 4 questions and give each other relatively the same amount of time to answer them. So one person takes 10 minutes, the other person takes 10 minutes. And that's important just to eliminate a power imbalance that can happen when one person talks on and on and on and the other person doesn't get the chance. Yeah. And the first question is, what in your life experience has led you to believe the things that you do about this particular topic? And so you give people a chance to tell their story. Now, this is so important because, we're narrative by our nature as human beings. We listen through stories. I can give you an example. I did a mediation between two folks, an issue that had emerged out of a community leadership group I was facilitating, where one of the guys in the group was an African-American man who at some point said in the group, in my church, we believe that homosexuality is a sin. And one of the gay men in the group was deeply offended by it and left, and it became a real issue in this group that this had happened. So they asked me to do a mediation between the two men. And the first guy talked first. Actually, it was the gay guy who talked first and told his story. Then the second guy told his story. He grew up in an area of Washington, D.C., which was rife with gang violence when he was growing up. And 4 or 5 of his friends growing up were killed through gang violence. And he said the only thing that had saved his life was the church, was that his mother insisted he go to the church. And they kept him from getting involved in this stuff. So he didn't question anything his pastor said. And he embellished more than that. But the other guy, listening to him, said, wow, as much as I don't agree with what you believe in, I can get how you could do feel that way, given that circumstance, right? And so it already started to shift. Then the second question is, what about the other position frightens you, scares you, or worries you? And this is where people can really share their vulnerability. And this is such an important piece because human behavior is almost always driven to some degree by fear, by either protecting ourselves or by doing something so that we don't get in danger. And so when we begin to understand what makes us afraid, it makes it much easier for us to begin to speak to the needs of that person. Then the third is, and this one's a really interesting conversation piece, is there anything you'd like to ask this person that you've never had a chance to ask somebody from that group? And this was the funniest moment in this interaction, where the African-American guy said, the other guy said, when did you choose to be gay? And the guy responds by saying, I know you're familiar with this, Rose. The guy responded by saying, I don't know, when did you choose to be straight? And the guy's jaw literally dropped to his chest. It was like, well, I didn't. I just was. And the guy says, exactly.
Yeah.
It was really the
Powerful.
most profound moment in the whole thing, right? And then the last piece is there anything that you'd like to say to clean up the past with either this person or that the group that they represent? And this is so important because in so many cases, when we have an opening in our lives to see people or situations differently, like when people realize their homophobia, and or, you know, I've seen this with so many people who have a child who comes out. And then all of a sudden, they've been homophobic all their lives. And all of a sudden, this child who they've loved more than life itself, they find out is gay or lesbian. And their whole world changes, you know, but they're still sort of embarrassed now by their past. They're ashamed of their past. And so it's this, they don't quite know how to move forward. And so when we clean it up, when we can sit down and say, look, in the past, I've said this, I want you to know I apologize to you for that. And in the future, you can count on me. And this is, in fact, what happened in this incident I was talking about. The guy closed by saying, look, I still have a long way to go to understand what it is to be gay. He says, but I want you to know that in listening to you, I realize the harm I've done simply by listening to people tell jokes or laughing at jokes that people told. And I want you to know I apologize for that. And I promise you, I will never listen to somebody tell a joke like that again without saying anything. And it kind of almost tears to my eyes remembering it, you know, because a whole new future is created by that. And that, in that way, we can leave the past behind and create from the future instead of having to be bound by the past.
Wow. Well, that is such a generous tool that you're sharing with us. I mean, those 4 questions, you know, bringing others to lunch. I really like that concept, and it's bringing back discourse. And I feel like that's a piece that's missing. And you know, I used to live in Washington, D.C., and one of the things I loved about living there was to go out and knowing that I would be engaging with people from many different political backgrounds, and having the ability to kind of talk through issues and being able to hear the difference of opinion, whether or not I agreed with it or not, it still felt like civil discourse. And like you said throughout this interview, it feels like with social media, it's easier to kind of go into our own tribes. And so this is something that is so valuable and can be used in our lives in different ways. And I feel like in the workplace in particular, with a skilled facilitator, I think that could really help leaders and help workers as well, kind of work across differences and, you know, ignite that innovation and the trust and rapport that you need to move an organization closer to achieving its mission. So I thank you for that. I think that's super helpful.
Yeah. Rose, if I could throw one more thing in, I think
Please, yeah.
one of the reasons I think this is so important is because we've gotten to the point where we no longer deny people's ideas, we deny their humanity.
Yes.
We have to recognize that that person on the other side, you know, even if they disagree with you, even if they believe in a candidate you don't believe in, they're still human beings. They're still
Yes.
struggling with the same dynamics that all of us are. You know, how do I, you know, avoid pain and seek pleasure? How do I make sure that my children do well in the world? You know, all of these kinds of things that are there. And the more we know each other for who we are, the less we treat each other like what we are. And the less we treat each other like what we are, the more opportunity there is to reach people and come to ways to work together to solve some of these problems.
Yes. I think that's a great way to round out the interview. And Howard, I want to thank you again for being a part of the summit. Before we go, can you let us know where the best place to find you online is so we can learn more about the amazing work you're doing and just to continue learning from you?
Sure. Right now, the best website to reach me at is howardjross.com. And people feel free to send me an email, howard@udarta.com. Also on Twitter at Howard J. Ross, and on Facebook. So people can, you know, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well. I'm pretty active on social media, and I'd love to connect with anybody there.
Great. Thank you so much. And in closing, I want to thank you again for your wisdom. And for participants, we'll have additional information, including workbooks and other takeaways from this amazing conversation in our follow-up materials. So don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out your options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. And every purchase helps me pay for the speakers like Howard for their generosity, their wisdom, and labor, and helping us grow the belonging movement. So thank you, Howard. Thanks again for being today's featured belonging champion. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Rhodes.